Hello, welcome to ReCrafted. Basically just a little series where I find some old Minecraft mini games or similar and I just do my best to try to reprogram them in 1.19 or whatever happens to be the new version at the time. This time around, I decided to start off strong with a recreation of Snake, the game from Mineplex created back in 2013, with Mineplex shutting down and then coming back, and then shutting down and then coming back recently. I decided I wanted to give it a shot. I wanted to see if I can make some of these games, see how difficult they are, what I can do. And so this is like a little time lapse of me developing my thought process. I'm gonna do my best to kind of explain as I go along what I thought, what was happening, what I wanted it to look like versus what it was actually gonna end up looking like. The choices I made for certain features, all that sort of stuff. I'm gonna go through most of it, if not all of it. So let's go ahead and just jump right in. So to start off, we're gonna kind of watch as I slowly build my way through the config. My mentality was I wanted to build this sort of like you'd see a lot of public plugins that have some sort of arena concept where you basically like select an arena's area and then that entire section of the world becomes known as that arena. And so this is me kind of working through my test command, trying to set up a method of creating a new arena. So the method I chose to go along with this was to make use of world edit, because there's no point in trying to recreate the wheel trying to have a section of the world selected. Might as well use world edit. There's a lot of features already built into that. Very, very helpful, used by a lot of plugins as is. So I figured it'd be a good use for it here. So early on, before I even started recording any of this, because this was kind of a last minute decision to sort of try to make this time lapse out of it, I already built some packet code based around mounting and spawning custom entities for custom AI and all that sort of stuff. It definitely was not required to be used here. I decided to use it mainly because I just like the idea of learning Mojang mappings and packets and all those sort of features. I could have definitely done it in probably just plain old bucket API. It's not difficult concepts. It's just some velocity modification and then making it to where when you click on the entity, you can mount it. Not that that feature was ever actually used in the case of this specific project, since once the game starts, you automatically mount the entity. As well, this was a chance for me to learn a little bit more about the paper API, since that's what I'm building off of instead of just plain spigots. So the first little bit here, you see me messing a lot more with the chat color and similar features, because I was just struggling to figure out how the new chat color system works since they deprecated the original spigot one. So continuing along, you can see I'm successfully creating the arena. It's showing up inside of the config as intended. I'm just trying to work out some tab completion features. This is the main reason why I did decide to go through Papers API instead of Spigots, because they have the command map as public, which means I can create new commands and all those sort of things without actually having to go through the plugin YML side of it. Makes my life a lot easier, means less thinking. I can set up tab complete and a lot of other things much, much quicker this way. So real quick here, you do kind of see me messing with that packet code, that custom entity class that I built a little bit. I was trying to remove the whole right-click to mount feature and the WASD control, since that wasn't going to be needed in this sort of situation. So I just had it set up that wherever the player is looking is the direction that the sheep will end up moving. As well, I am organizing the arena class. This is going to be used so that I can actually define and store all these arenas in memory. This is going to make my life a lot easier when it comes to adding players to the arena when they choose to join, and as well just handling game states, handling timers, features, snakes, everything else like that. That's all going to be handled inside of these classes, and another subclass that I'll create later on called the player snake class. As well, I'm building the snake class, the snake command here. This is just going to be used so that I can have a spawn point, that if a player leaves the arena, they are teleported to the spawn point and not just kind of like left in the arena doing nothing. As well, I eventually add the exact same feature to the arena command to set a spawn point in the arena, just to have a location that I can teleport the players to when they choose to connect. Just setting up some more. I kind of built this plugin with the idea of releasing it. I don't intend to release any of these plugins, mainly because a lot of them are just stealing ideas from other servers. I don't think it's fair of me to release these sorts of games, because they're not my original ideas by any means. And plus, a lot of that source code already exists on the internet. If you really wanted to, you could probably go find the source code for Mineplex and Snake and all that sort of stuff and just copy theirs. I don't recommend doing that. It's their code. It's not worth the fight to try to say that is yours. So I'm continuing along. I'm just setting up an arena manager class so I can easily access and connect players to, reload, refresh, all that sort of stuff, all the different arenas that are required. Setting up a simple logging, everything that I could possibly need to get the arenas wherever commands happen to need them. As well, I'm adding a join feature into the snake so that players can run /snake join and the arena name, and they'll connect into the arena that they are supposed to, no problem. That just links into the arena manager class that stores where the player happens to be, and then sends a message to the actual individual arena class that says, hey, this player is connected, add them to your list, and do whatever sort of calculation you have to do based around them. In reality, it just teleports them into the arena and then stores them inside of stores their UUID inside of a list. So we're just going to jump ahead here in a second to after I fumbled with text colors and chat features and everything for a very long time. I was trying to set up an automated feature just to have put in the usual like and1 and 2 for chat messages and then color and text format everything as intended. I realized that that really wasn't going to work with the current system unless I wanted to go back to the chat color API made by Spigot. Decided to not do that, and instead I just fumbled around trying to make a chat utility for about 3 hours. And so we're just going to kind of like jump past that because that's not that important and didn't end up being used. I deleted it after realizing it wasn't going to happen. So coming back after our little 2-hour time warp, we are now working on the start game feature, just trying to figure out what I'm actually going to need to do to consider the game started, what needs to be spawned, how the player needs to be spawned, all that sort of stuff. That's all going to be handled here. I also set up a start reason feature where I could just say, hey, is it an automated start because 8 players are in the game, or is it a forced start because I came around and forced started it? I wanted a different feature. I don't have to wait the same time in both cases. So I wanted it to where they would like instantly start the game if I'm the one running command, or it would use a timer feature if it is an automated start because of the number of players. Continuing to set up the timer feature, I had to make sure that the timer actually ended once the timer is 0. Worked no problem here. Next up, I was trying to figure out sound effects to know what kind of sounds I'd want to play, setting up a helper function based around that so I could play it to all players in the arena. I set up the exact same kind of Mineplex countdown sound effect and pling whenever the game starts. It worked. It sounded surprisingly good, and I didn't really think it was going to work out that well. I thought they had some sort of pitch mod on it to some extent, but it didn't end up being like that. Next up, I was attempting to math out how to spawn the players. I needed to find a way to evenly space out the players all around the arena in a reasonably circular kind of zone. I didn't want to spawn them all in the center because then they can actually kill each other just by the game starting. I didn't want to spawn them all together. I didn't want to have to manually set spawn points either because that could become a massive mess. And so I wanted to see if I could math it out. And so this is me trying to make use of WorldEdit's API, among other things, trying to see if I can find that way to easily gap out the player's location. As well, I'm launching up another Minecraft client so that I can test the spawn locations and seeing the different options that it's recommending that players spawn at. But eventually along the way here, I realized that this entire method is probably not going to work, and so instead I googled some math functions to evenly gap out points along a circle, and within a couple seconds here, join the arena started, everyone spawns on equal distances away, works as intended, and then I move on to the next feature. The next setup I am doing is trying to actually organize the player snake side of it, having it to where there are going to be a bunch of snakes following a leader. That is what most of this code is going to be used for the next reasonable little while. It's me trying to set up the AI to actually track the snake in front of them. For some reason, I wasn't able to wrap my head around the fact that it was the velocities that I was setting that was causing the snakes to act the way they were. So here I'm just kind of setting up my event handler to have it to where the player can actually move on the snake and control where the snake is going, and as well setting it up where the player will not be able to jump off of the snake by accident or on purpose if they chose to do that for some reason or another. As well, after I did actually figure out the concept of, hey, looking straight down, you can see me here, I look straight down, sheep stops moving, can't have that feature, and so I tried to figure out some math to follow the direction that the player is looking instead of just where the head is looking. So now, no matter what, no matter how the player looks for the head, looking up, down, left, right, it's going to follow their body's position instead of their vertical position. That helped make it to where players couldn't look straight up or straight down to stop the sheep from moving, because that is definitely not intended. You can see me trying to figure out the math for this. It took me a very long time to think about the simple concept of just open how they calculate the look direction instead of trying to, again, reinvent the wheel, which I have a bad habit of doing here. Eventually, I do realize that there's a lot of like attempted math and features to figure out how I want to divide things. figuring out if there's like a consistent system, like does it add up to 1? Does it add up to 2? How is this math meant to work? I soon realized that it uses like sine, cos, just trigonometric functions instead. I'm not the best at math when it comes to programming. It's not my strong suit, but I figured it out eventually. It took me a lot longer than I'd like to admit. After I opened up the get direction function, I realized, oh, that's a lot easier than I thought, and bam, worked exactly as intended. Continuing along, I decided to add the hit detection for the snake, just knowing if I'm hitting a sheep, if I'm hitting a slime, or similar, having the snake grow or change based around that information. I had to also modify the grow body function to have it actually put the sheep behind the player, because the sheep was constantly triggering itself, which means the player would instantly die in the event that they attempted to play the game even for a second. And so I tried my best to do some math, figuring out how to place the sheep actually behind the player. Eventually, I did have a solution to this using the Bucket API instead of trying to use NMS and network code, because their velocity feature seemed to work a lot better in this specific situation. It took me a long time to actually have that idea, though, sadly. Got there soon, just like 6 or 7 hours in development instead of what could have been way less if I just didn't use network code at all. Definitely something I would change next time is just avoiding Mojang mappings as much as possible. They're very fun to use. They're very easy to use because everything is named. You can know exactly what does what and read the function as is. Eventually I did get the math figured out and said, okay, yeah, that looks good. Set up a simple build snake function to actually have it spawn the sheep back to back to back to back and create that usual sheep kind of snake design that you'd expect to see in this. Next up, I had to set up the tracking for slimes and sheep so that players could actually eat. As well, I set up in the arena function, which the player snake has access to, a hit sheep method to say, hey, is this sheep a part of myself or another snake? If it is, then we're going to add the kill message into the chat saying, this player has died for X reason or similar. As well, I'm adding the game tick loops to actually spawn slime as needed. Continuing to expand my list just to say, what more stuff is going to be required. Game loop gets built. It's just going to be a simple repeating task, repeats every tick. Make sure there's at least, at least 2 plus the number of players in the arena slimes existent. So if there's 8 players in the arena, there'll be at least 10 slimes. So there'll always be more slimes than there are players. It guarantees to constantly spawn new ones. It just allows me to 100% guarantee that there's food somewhere on the arena without the players having to search around for ages to find them. Surprisingly enough, this took a long time for me to figure out why the slimes weren't spawning. Because by what I thought, they should be spawning no problem, but they did not in this specific case. Now, what ended up happening? I don't remember, but they suddenly started working, and so I saw no problems, and I just kind of moved along. I had the snake building properly, although it wasn't staying in a proper line like I really wanted them to, and so I was adding some more features just to try to keep the snakes in a nice line instead of clumping together like they still visibly are. Eventually I got it to work just using a little bit of timing, and also just changing the way the look vector works for the entities, so that instead of them looking the same direction as the leading entity, so if the leading entity suddenly turns right, every single sheep is going to suddenly start turning right even though they're moving forward. And so I just changed that feature to force them to look at the sheep in front of them instead of any kind of other sheep, and that resulted in the proper snake design that you'd expect to see in this sort of game. Next up, I was trying to get hit detection to work. I realized after trying to test the death features that hit detection was not working in the slightest. So I decided to restart the server because my computer was kind of freezing up, making everything not build properly, and actually add a couple of death features and similar to the game to allow me to add spectators, stop the game from continuing if the player dies, all that sort of stuff. This project was just a lot of build it, test it, find an error, build it, test it, find an error, build it, test it, find an error. It was really difficult for me to build it, and that was the main time consumer when it came to this because my computer was not having fun trying to run the server, 2 Minecraft clients, and as well IntelliJ along with the build scripts, and so it made building take literally forever. But, still got it done, got the project done in the end of the day, worked out pretty well overall. So moving on along with the code, next up I'm trying to set up the randomized colors I kind of realized that because the classes are not actually considered being a sheep, it's considered an unknown entity. There's no way for me to tell Bucket to set the sheep's color because it doesn't think that it is a sheep. And so I decided just to mess around with entity data, which soon I realized didn't work. And then after messing around with entity data, I decided to go the simpler method of just extending sheep on my multiple entity class that was controlling everything. And then I could easily just set the color with a set color function. Super, super simple. Again, if I just did this with Bucket API, none of this would have been required. It would have been much, much easier, a lot less jumping around between network code and building and motion mappings and everything. It would have been a lot cleaner, a lot nicer, and a lot less weird nuances kind of appearing while testing. But final result, sheep does spawn correctly. You do visibly, in fact, see the nice and long sheeps created. And the timer system works for it, no problem. So now it's a lot of me just changing, trying to make the style a little bit nicer, trying to make sure that I actually like the way the sheeps are gapped out, setting up the timers correctly, making sure it's all working as intended, and making sure that the death feature works, which it does. And that was the end, which you can finally just hear the sound effect of the counter, just the Mineplex counter that you'd expect to hear. But that's the end. Sheep was successfully created. Game worked as intended. I went on to test it later on in the night. Didn't record the test, unfortunately, but me and my friends got together on a server. It's just 4 of us. We played a couple rounds for a good hour or so. Game worked almost perfectly. A couple of issues I found with how the players are being spawned, but otherwise it worked as intended. I'm happy with the way it came out. Total development time for this full project was roughly 9 hours. Actual development time. Real-time hours closer to maybe 12. But I'm happy with how it came out. I'm happy with the results of the project, and I am definitely intending to do this again with some other games.